Hello, everybody. I am Natasha Ruiz Gomez, and I will show you my screen again in a second. I just wanted to tell you that I specialize in 19th century and modern art here at the University of Essex, and my area of expertise is French art, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to briefly tell you about myself and how I came to study art history. I wanted to say a couple of words about the importance of art history now as I see it, and then I'll discuss Manet. So I'm going to go back to my screen. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see my screen now, and I'm going to turn my distracting little self off. Hopefully I'll be able to get myself back on later. Okay, so I thought in order to talk about why one should study art history, that I would go back to my defining encounter, the moment that convinced me to study art history. And that was an exhibition of sculpture, of the sculpture of Constantine Brancusi at the Pompidou Center in Paris in 1995. So it was a long time ago now. I don't know why, I don't remember why I went to see this exhibition. I have no idea. I'd never heard of Brancusi at the time, but I went back 3 times ultimately to see it because I just couldn't believe my eyes. This work didn't seem crafted by human hands. And I just wanted to know more about it. I think that's why I kept going back to this exhibition. And here you see the reconstruction of Brancusi's studio at the Pompidou Center. So when we can all get back to Paris, you can actually go walk around the studio and see the works themselves. So that moment for me of awe, of wonder, and of just excitement is something that I try to invoke in my own teaching and in my own research. Because obviously for art history, there's an engagement with a real thing, whether it's a painting or a drawing or a sculpture. There are some exceptions, obviously, in the last 50 years or so, which I'll just set aside for the moment. But the first thing that you have to do as an art historian is try to describe what it looks like. And that's actually really, really, really hard. Translating the visual to the verbal is incredibly difficult. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing we have to do is we have to consider how what it looks like conveys information. And I think that's especially important in the world today, where there's so much that's visual, right? There's visual world around us. We carry around in our pockets something that shows us pictures all the time. And what we call in art history formal analysis or visual analysis is, I think, especially critical now when our lives are just dominated by visual culture. So I show you here a few examples, almost chosen kind of at random. There's the cover of Vanity Fair from a while back now with Madonna, who is imitating Atlas, a figure from mythology who is meant to hold up the world, knowing that tells us something about her pretensions. The cover of a Coldplay album, which has Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, a work about revolution. And that, again, also tells us something about the intent of the artists who created this music. A poster from the last Indiana Jones movie, where the question of scale tells us something about who is more important and who is less important. And this is something that goes back to, for example, medieval painting. And then at the bottom right, there's a picture that I just cut and pasted from Instagram within the last week, a woman who is recreating under lockdown famous paintings. So you see the original painting here on the left, and then her recreation with loo roll and other things on the right. Right. So some of the questions that we ask about art are: who created it? Why was it created? What impact did it have then at the time? Because works of art, of course, travel through time. They have a history. And this the object is an entree into a historical moment, into the intellectual history that it's a part of. And it allows us to learn about an era's politics, religion, literature, science, its celebrities, etc. So my work, for example, looks at the sculpture, the photography, and the drawings of Auguste Rodin. And you see a work of his from 1900 here on the right-hand side. And I've been working on Rodin now for almost 20 years. And what interests me about his work is the ways in which it reacts to, challenges scientific and medical ideas of the time. Right, so I'm showing you here next to this object called the Walking Man, a sculpture which you see has no head or arms, but when Degas, the artist Edgar Degas, purportedly asked Rodin why it didn't have a head or arms, Rodin supposedly said, "You don't need those to walk, you just need legs." So I'm showing it to you here in comparison to a chrono photograph, a photograph taken over time by a French scientist around the same time in the in the 1880s, 1890s, where the scientist was trying to capture the human gait, tried to understand how humans walk physically, where the limbs are as human beings walk. He did this with animals, some animals too. And Rodin said at the time that photographs actually lie and that artists tell the truth, because in reality, time doesn't stop. And he said that what he was trying to capture in his sculpture was the full movement of the walk, from the step, kind of the moment you start taking the step, through the action of stepping, through that kind of front foot, putting it itself down on the ground. So as you can see already, even from this example of my own research, art history is interdisciplinary, right? It uses more than one discipline. It's in the title, art history, right? And obviously Essex has lots of interdisciplinary art history schemes with literature and modern languages, etc. And so what we do, what we art historians do, is basically apply various theoretical models to the artwork and the moment in which it was created. So we engage with that object on a more, we could say, theoretical or philosophical level. And so art history expands your critical skills by exercising both your visual and your verbal muscles. And it allows one, I think, poised to comprehend and, more importantly, to question the world that we live in today. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the time that I have is to talk a little bit about a very famous artist, Edouard Manet, and ultimately relate his work to today. It'll take a good 15 minutes, so I'll ask you to just be patient. So here is Manet looking very fashionable in a photograph by a very well-known kind of portrait photographer named Edouard. Now, Manet was a really crucial figure in the transition from realism, the artistic movement realism, to impressionism. And he's often thought of as an impressionist. He actually never exhibited with them, although he was clearly influenced by them near the end of his life. So really, he considered himself a realist, and he was interested in the city. He himself was the son of a wealthy and high-ranking civil servant in Paris, and so he received an allowance until his 30s. So he didn't have to struggle to live as an artist, which meant that he could paint, for the most part, what he wanted. He traveled, he visited Belgium, Holland, Germany, Austria, Italy, and Spain. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And though he's considered quite radical today, at the time he was actually somewhat conservative. But as you can see, he was a dandy, or what Baudelaire, the lyric poet and art critic, Charles Baudelaire, called in the mid-19th century a flaneur. And a flaneur was somebody, a man who walked the city, who observed, who was part of the city, but who looked. Right? And obviously that notion of looking is really important for Manet as an artist. So here is this kind of moment of contemporary life. This painting is actually at the National Gallery of Art in London, so one day hopefully we'll all be able to visit it again. And this is his first painting of contemporary life, because there was music in the Tuileries Gardens in Paris a couple of times a week. between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. At the time, these were royal gardens, so they weren't public, so you had to pay to visit. So the people that we're seeing in this painting are people who could afford to pay just to listen to music in the afternoon, so middle and upper class. And this moment is especially, I think, fascinating because at this point, by 1861, for about 10 years, Emperor Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann, who was basically sort of the mayor of Paris, started to self-consciously transform the city of Paris to become modern. And the Paris that we all sort of, I think, have in our imagination now, the Paris of wide boulevards, of cafes, that was all created during this period of time. So just like Manet himself was self-consciously modern, Paris itself was self-consciously modern too. So in this painting, we see people looking directly out at us. For example, these two women here. We see details of fashion, right? These little girls are very nicely dressed to go to the park, for example. We see as well some kind of shout outs. So here is Baudelaire, Manet's friend. Here's Manet's brother. And here, just on the edge, is a self-portrait of Manet himself. So we see these individuals all out for strolling, out to be viewed, out to look at other people too. And we also see the predominance of these top hats, which I think is interesting because they sort of mimic and even blend into the trees in the park. Now this was, as I said, a royal park. This was a cultivated French garden. It's a landscape, but it's artificial too. And so I think Manet is kind of playing with that in this painting. So this idea of being self-consciously modern is, I think, especially interesting in relation to the portraits of one of Manet's favorite models, Victorine Mural. Now, Manet always painted portraits. Yeah, okay, it was a way to make money, but if you're interested in the face, if you're interested in identity, if you're interested in masquerade, then the face is a really interesting place to play. So portraits are really about inventing the self, right? Not just the person who is being portrayed, but the artist too. And an artist and a sitter are in dialogue with each other. They're kind of using each other in the creation of a portrait. So this is probably his first painting of Victorine Mural. There are very famous paintings of her, including Olympia and the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or the luncheon on the grass. I'm going to show you other ones in a minute. But as I said, this is probably the first one he did of her. And it seems the most, quote unquote, real, as if it's not about masquerade. Right? And you can see, I think, quite clearly some characteristics of how he painted. Her face is rather flat, right? So you can see here a kind of clear, almost line where between shadow and light. And normally artists, or traditionally artists, tried to be much more gradual in that kind of transition. And they wasn't interested in that. And what that ends up doing is making this part of her face look remarkably flat. He also was let brushstrokes stay visible. So if you look, for example, here on her chin, the paint looks like paint, right? It's very easy to see that. And if you kind of create a look with a soft focus, it starts to look more like a chin, but yet it really looks like paint. And that's visible too in her eyelashes, where the paint itself covers her eye, right? You can just sort of see that there, hopefully. And even this kind of little ribbon she's wearing as a necklace, this quote unquote skin that he's painted seems to actually go over it sometimes, right? So he's interested clearly in doing other things and just trying to make something look realistic. And you'll see that the background here is relatively nondescript, and I'll show you another example of that in a few minutes. Then he painted her again, in this case as the street singer. So this, he said, was a scene he'd observed one evening in his neighborhood. He was walking by a cafe or restaurant, and a street singer started walking out. And so he decided to execute this scene in his studio with Victorine Mural as his model. So he's trying to show a snapshot, right? He's trying to capture this kind of glimpsed moment, but in paint. And you can see again, there's very little modeling. Her face looks pretty flat. It almost looks as if a flash has gone off and captured her image. And there are some theories that he actually used photographs in the studio, although it's not clear if he did or not. So we have these really kind of strong contrasts, dark and light. But hopefully you can also just make out that there's a figure here in the back, a kind of waiter, right? And there are a few people back here. And she seems much too large in comparison to where that person is. Right? So he's basically choosing, he's a good painter. He knew how to paint, quote unquote, correctly, but he's choosing to do things differently. So here is this image of a woman very much in the foreground, taking up the whole space. She is the focal point. You can see her, she's eating some kind of grapes or cherries while she walks out holding her guitar. But what I want to point out here too is, again, this moment down here in the hem of this dress, where we see not just a slightly transparent kind of fabric, but we see paint again as paint, right? The virtuosity, the kind of confidence of leaving paint to look like paint, but at the same time looking like this kind of almost transparent skirt that she's wearing. And then he painted her again in this painting, Mademoiselle V, in the costume of an espada. So here it is quite clear from the title that this is art. This is art that's made of models and costumes. Right? And if you know anything about bullfighting, you know that she's not wearing the right shoes. The cape that she's holding is the wrong color. Even though she's wearing the costume, a male costume, it's actually more revealing of her kind of feminine shape. So it would have been seen as being sort of sexy at the time. But again, there are figures in the background back here that look way too small, again, in comparison to where she's standing, right? She should either be a lot smaller or they should be a lot bigger. And what is clear is that he's copying from or quoting from this print by Francisco Goya. So I mentioned earlier that he visited Spain. He was really influenced by Spanish art. And so here he is taking somebody who at the time had created these artworks only about 50 years before. So this was somebody who wasn't sort of long dead, but he's quoting here, right? So any kind of educated viewer would look at this painting and say, oh, look, there's a bit of Goya in the background, right? In other words, this is art about art, right? Not necessarily art just about reality. And the fact that he was looking at art from Spain as opposed to art from Italy was actually really a bold move, because influences at the time were traditionally from the Italian Renaissance. So he's clearly looking for a new language with which to paint. At the same time, he's also looking at the art of Velázquez, who you see one of his portraits here. So Velázquez is known in art history as kind of a painter of painters. And so that kind of nondescript background, we see that he's taken in part from Velázquez. So you can see Velázquez here has painted this portrait, and he's given us a little bit of shadow, right? So we get a sense of three-dimensionality of this figure in space, but there's no kind of clear demarcation of back wall and floor, right? This person is standing in this really vague space. So it brings all of our attention really to the sitter, to the person in the portrait. And we see Manet then doing that here in the Pfeiffer. So this is actually also a portrait of Victorine Mural in the guise of a young boy this time. So he really neutralizes her sexuality in this painting. And we see that he's taken that kind of vague, nondescript background from Velázquez, but even the kind of shadows he's done in an even more cursory or schematic way. Right? So there's really little to ground this figure in three-dimensional space. Instead, this is the focus on this person's posture, the expression, the fingers moving on that instrument. And it's very hard to tell in reproductions, but there's actually lots to see in this black of this jacket. And again, he's probably also taking that from Velázquez as well. And then the final painting that I want to talk about of Victorine Mural is Woman with a Parrot, which you see here on the far right. So we see her standing in a dress. The painting itself is mostly sort of pinks and grays. There's a parrot up here as on a perch, as hopefully you can see. And so here she is depicted as a fashionable Parisian, probably in the process of getting ready to go out for a ball. Now, interestingly, when critics talked about this painting at the time, they talked about it in formal terms. And again, by form, I mean color, scale, etc. So one critic wrote in 1868, quote, "But when in a painting there is neither composition, nor drama, nor poetry, the technique must be perfect." And here, this is not the case. The head he shows us is certainly not flattering. Over commonplace and poorly drawn features, he spreads an earthy color which does not represent the flesh tint of a young woman's fair complexion, etc. So for a long time, these paintings by Manet, these very kind of rich and complex paintings, were described in just visual terms. And that's in part because they were a bit scandalous, and they're a little bit hard for people to get their head around. So in the terms of this painting specifically, we can look at a caricature of the period, which tells us what people were actually looking at, right? What they were really kind of thinking about when they were looking at this painting, which is almost life-size, I should mention. So what do we see? We see the Victorine Mural standing here, holding a monocle, right? So she's holding it here, but the caricaturist has really exaggerated this, as he has exaggerated the eye of the parrot, right? So what does this tell us about this painting and its meaning? Well, first of all, the monocle was something used by men. So that's probably a man's monocle that she's holding, right? She's holding a little bunch of violets in her hand, probably a gift from a man as well. And the parrot's gaze is actually quite important. Why would Manet put a parrot in this painting? Well, since the 16th century, really, in France, there had been an erotic association between women and parrots. It seems kind of silly. It was actually a common pet in 19th century France. And there are lots of examples in literature, for example, of women and parrots. And why the association was erotic was because the parrot was seen as the intimate companion of the woman. So the parrot would see her undress, but he would also see her with her lovers, right, who would enter her room. And so this, again, this comparison might seem kind of strange to our eyes, but if we look at contemporary advertising, and these are from the last few years, these adverts with Julianne Moore for jewelry, we see the same exact association being made, right? A nude model wearing jewelry with, the bird, right? So we have here the importance of visual culture for the study of art. 50 years ago, you didn't talk about caricatures, you didn't talk about visual culture. But now we understand that that kind of visual culture, caricatures, advertisements, etc., tell us about the people at the time, but also, as we can see here, about ourselves. It's quite revealing. Okay, so to get to my main point then, these portraits of Victorine Mural are not portraits, I think, in the traditional sense, right? But they're a statement about modern identity. Right? Remember, Paris was being remade at this time into a self-consciously modern city. Everybody living in Paris understood that that's what was happening. So these paintings are a statement on modern identity, that it's something that we assume like a costume. It's not something that's inherent to us. There are different facades, different masks that we put on at different moments. And again, we can see that quite clearly in modern stars or celebrities today. And here I show you some images of David Beckham, the famous footballer, right? here he is, you know, as the star, literally star footballer. Here he's kind of a kind of homeboy, bad guy. Here he is at the royal wedding, in formal dress. And then here he is as the guy that you are worried about bringing home to your parents, right? And we can argue that we do this ourselves in our daily lives. We're different individual at home with our families, or at school with our teachers, or out with our friends. So I think Manet has a lot to tell us about what it means to be modern and to live in the world. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Manet, I have some sources here that are all online and free. And these are excellent, basically, books that have been put online. So I can certainly share this with you if you want to learn more. But I will, for the moment, stop here, and so that we have some time to answer your questions.